Papyrus is made from the papyrus plant, which grows along the banks of the River Nile in Egypt. The stem is cut into sections. These sections are then flattened out and laid down in alternating horizontal and vertical strips. And they're beaten and flattened. And the natural juices in the fibre act as an adhesive, bonding the different layers together. They're stacked up in a large pile and then pressed and dried. And at the end of the process, you have quite a smooth, flexible writing surface, which was the standard medium for writing in the Mediterranean world for many centuries.
In the first century, the main vehicle for producing and writing and transmitting literary texts would have been a papyrus roll. And books, speeches, plays, history writing would have been written on a roll of papyrus and stored in libraries, private libraries, and also public libraries in the first century. The roll form is simply a rolled up sheet of papyrus that you have individual sheets. Papyrus is constructed in individual sheets, maybe about 10 inches by 10 inches. I mean, there's various sizes you can get. And then they can be glued together into a roll form. In fact, that's mostly how they were marketed. People, of course, had other mechanisms as well. You might use a wax type of tablet for composing and then transcribe that once you'd got it right onto a roll.
Because papyrus was quite expensive, you didn't write on a piece of papyrus unless you had a jolly good reason to. So it was it tended only to be important works of literature which were written on papyrus. Important financial transactions were recorded on pieces of papyrus. You didn't sort of write your private diary unless you were very rich on a piece of papyrus. Papyri were also used extensively in religious contexts. In particular, Jewish books of scripture were written on rolls of papyrus. Roman scriptures were also written on rolls of papyrus as well.
Scrolls were the ubiquitous format for writing in the ancient world. Libraries typically comprised thousands of scrolls which were stored horizontally in almost like pigeonholes with tags on the ends so that they could be identified. Gradually, in the first centuries AD, the scroll form was replaced by the codex form, the book as we know it. It was a very long process, and it was about 500 AD before the scroll was completely replaced by the book. And even now, of course, scrolls do have some particular uses. For instance, in the Jewish tradition, sacred writings are still written on Torah scrolls. But by 500, the book had generally replaced the scroll form. And it was a characteristic of the Christian writers that they used the book form at a very early date.
Initially, in the first century, Christians copied their sacred texts, both the Old Testament and the now written accounts about Jesus, were written on scrolls, on papyrus scrolls, big, unwieldy things that you had to roll up and then unroll again. So in the second century, Christians adopted a relatively new form of technology, what we call today the book. And this was much more easy to use because it was smaller and the pages were numbered, so you could easily find a particular portion of text that you wanted to read out. So Christians very quickly gravitated towards using the book, and it was their sacred text in particular which they wrote down in these books.
When people first started making books, they simply took a roll, chopped it up again, and created a book by putting all the sheets in one and then folding it. So it's a book form.
The early Christian writers would have been writing on fairly small sizes of papyrus. There's a limit to the size of sheets that you can create for papyrus. And the book would have been a fairly square format book, we think, probably maybe 9 inches square, bound with maybe just a simple leather covering. We don't know exactly how the notebooks were formed, whether the text was written in the sheet form and then bound, or whether the leaves were bound together and then written as a continuous book. Certainly in the medieval period, scribes almost always wrote their texts on flat sheets, which were then folded and bound into a book. It's obviously easier to do that. Early codices or notebooks were devised by Christian writers, and there are various theories as to why that was. Some people think that it made it easier to refer to particular texts or to compare texts. It's easier to turn the leaves of a codex than it is to unravel a scroll. Other people think that it made the texts more portable, and as early Christians moved around the Eastern Mediterranean, they were swapping texts and copying texts, and the codex form made that process easier.
It's more convenient, it's more economical actually, because you write on both sides. With a roll you only write on the inside. You could certainly, one of the things Marshall says, you can hold it in one hand, whereas a roll you always had to have the two-handed approach.
The advantage of a book form over a scroll was that you could contain a large amount of text in a small portable volume, and the pages were numbered often, so you could very often find the particular part of the book that you were looking for simply by looking at the page numbers, which was very difficult in an unwieldy scroll.
In the first century, we certainly have some evidence for not the roll form, but the book form beginning to be used. All of our early Christian material is in a book form, whereas the secular literary texts, the classics, the Homer, Euripides, Demosthenes, these sort of texts remain on rolls until the 3rd, 4th century, whereas Christians adopted the book form, the codex form, much earlier. Certainly in the 2nd century, when our evidence is rich.